I still laugh when people ask me what the dumbest fight I've ever had with my HOA was, because if I told them it all started with a trash can sitting at the curb on pickup morning, they'd probably think I was exaggerating, but I'm not. That ridiculous little plastic bin turned into the thing that exposed an entire board for playing favorites, abusing their authority, and eventually destroying their own reputation. Looking back now, it almost feels like one of those stories that happens to somebody else, except I still remember every single detail, right down to the bright orange envelope taped to my front door. My name's Ethan Walker, and a couple years ago I moved into a neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates outside Lexington, Kentucky. It wasn't flashy or gated behind giant stone walls, just one of those quiet suburban communities where people waved while walking their dogs. Kids rode bikes until sunset, and every mailbox looked exactly the same because somebody on the HOA board apparently believed matching mailboxes were the cornerstone of civilization. Honestly, I liked the place. I'd spent 20 years working as a project estimator for a construction company, and after my divorce I wanted somewhere peaceful, somewhere predictable. My little brick house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac with a maple tree that turned bright red every October, and every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, the garbage truck rolled through around 8. I had a routine that never changed. Monday night, I'd wheel my trash and recycling bins to the curb. Tuesday morning, the truck emptied them, and before dinner Tuesday evening, I'd roll them back beside the garage where nobody could see them. I wasn't obsessive, just organized. My next-door neighbor, Linda, used to joke that if everyone in Willow Creek copied my habits, the HOA would probably go out of business because they'd have nothing left to complain about. We both laughed every time she said it. Turns out she was more right than either of us realized. One Thursday afternoon, I got home from work carrying groceries, and before I even unlocked the front door, I saw something bright taped to it. Orange. Loud enough to grab your attention from halfway across the driveway. At first, I figured it was some community picnic announcement or maybe another reminder about landscaping standards. Instead, the top of the paper read, "Notice of Visolation," in giant bold letters. I stood there in my driveway reading it twice because my brain refused to accept what it was saying. According to the HOA, I had violated community standards by leaving my trash containers visible outside the approved time period. The fine, $650. I actually laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so obviously ridiculous that my first instinct was to assume somebody had made a clerical mistake. Then I saw the next sentence. Future violations may result in doubled penalties and additional enforcement action. My smile disappeared pretty fast after that. $650 wasn't going to bankrupt me, but it wasn't pocket change either. And what bothered me even more was that I knew I hadn't done what they accused me of doing. I walked inside, set the groceries on the kitchen counter, and went straight to the cabinet where I'd stuffed the HOA handbook the day I moved in. You know the kind. 3-ring binder, faded pages, way thicker than it had any right to be. I flipped through section after section until I found waste disposal regulations. There it was in black and white. Trash containers must be stored at a public view within 24 hours following scheduled collection. I read it again, then once more. That's exactly what I'd been doing since the day I moved in. I even checked my security camera timestamps just to reassure myself I wasn't somehow remembering wrong. Every Tuesday evening, around 6 o'clock, there I was on video rolling the bins back beside the garage. So I sent a polite email to the property management office. No attitude, no accusations. I simply asked if they could provide the dates, times, and photographic evidence supporting the alleged violations because I believed there had been a misunderstanding. Then I waited. A week later, an email finally showed up with 3 attached photographs. I opened the first one while drinking coffee before work, and I nearly spit it across the kitchen. The timestamp read 7:46 Tuesday morning, garbage day. The city sanitation truck was literally visible in the background of the picture. Halfway down my street collecting everyone's trash, I clicked the second photo. Same thing. Third photo. Same thing again. Every picture showed my bin sitting exactly where every other homeowner's bins were supposed to be, waiting for pickup. I honestly thought that would be the end of it. I smiled, tipped another email explaining that their own evidence proved I hadn't violated the written rule, attached a screenshot of the handbook, and figured somebody would apologize for wasting everyone's time. The reply arrived the very next morning, and the single sentence buried in the middle of that email completely changed the direction of everything that followed. The sentence read, "Visibility alone constitutes non-compliance." I stared at my laptop for a solid minute, reading those 6 words over and over because they made absolutely no sense. Visibility alone? That wasn't what the rulebook said. It didn't even come close. The handbook talked about leaving trash containers out after collection, not simply allowing another human being to see them while they were waiting to be emptied. By that logic, every single homeowner in Willow Creek was technically breaking the rules every Tuesday morning. I leaned back in my chair and actually laughed. But it wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from finding something funny. It was the laugh you let out when you realize somebody thinks you're too stupid to notice what they're doing. I replied one more time, carefully, professionally, quoting the exact section from the handbook and attaching their own photographs. I wrote, "Can you please point me to the section authorizing this interpretation? I'm unable to locate any language supporting it." That email never received a real answer. Instead, 3 days later, I got another notice saying the fine remained outstanding. Additional late fees would begin accumulating after 30 days, and continued failure to comply could result in legal collection procedures. That was the moment I stopped treating the situation like a misunderstanding. It had become something else entirely. My neighbor Linda wandered over that evening while I was watering the flowers beside the porch. She noticed the paperwork spread across my patio table and asked what was going on. I handed her the violation notice and watched her eyebrows climb higher with every sentence. "Wait a second," she said, looking toward the street. "My trash cans are sitting out every Tuesday morning, too." "Everybody's are." I nodded. "Exactly," she frowned. "Then why aren't they fining everybody?" That question stayed with me all night because I couldn't answer it. I kept thinking there had to be something I was missing, some detail that explained why I had become the target. Then another memory floated back into my head. About 2 months earlier, the HOA had held a community meeting proposing a 20% increase in annual dues. I had stood up during the meeting and politely questioned where the extra money would go. Nothing dramatic. I simply asked for a detailed budget before asking homeowners to write bigger checks. A couple other residents had asked similar questions, and I distinctly remembered the board president, a woman named Sharon Caldwell, looking visibly irritated every time someone challenged her numbers. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Healthy communities ask questions. At least that's what I believed. The following Monday, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney named Daniel Pierce, someone I'd hired years earlier to review closing documents on another property. Daniel specialized in homeowner association disputes, which, judging from the stack of folders lining his office shelves, apparently kept him pretty busy. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything from the orange notice to the ridiculous visibility email. When I finished, he didn't immediately start talking about lawsuits or courtrooms. Instead, he asked one simple question. "Do you want to know if they're wrong, or do you want to know if they're targeting you?" I looked at him for a second before answering. "Honestly, both," he smiled. "Good answer." Daniel explained that Kentucky's nonprofit transparency laws allowed homeowners to request certain association records, including enforcement logs, violation histories, and documentation showing how rules had been applied. "If they're enforcing this fairly," he said, "the records will prove it. If they aren't, those same records will prove something much more interesting." 2 weeks later, several hundred pages arrived in digital form. I remember opening the files late on a Saturday morning with absolutely no expectations. I figured we'd probably find a handful of similar citations and move on from there. Instead, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table for nearly 6 hours, highlighting names, addresses, dates, and photographs until my coffee went cold. There were dozens, literally dozens, of inspection photos showing trash bins sitting beside curbs on Tuesday mornings. Some pictures looked almost identical to mine. Same streets, same garbage trucks, same timestamps. Yet almost every inspection ended with the exact same notation. No action taken. Compliant. No violation issued. I made a spreadsheet because that's just how my brain works. Construction estimating teaches you to organize data whether you want to or not. After entering every violation related to trash containers over the previous 18 months, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Only 3 homeowners had actually received fines. 3 out of hundreds of residents. My name was on that list. So was Linda's friend, Mark Henderson. The third belonged to a retired school principal named Grace Collins. I didn't know Grace personally, but Daniel did a little digging, and within an hour we discovered something remarkable. Every one of us had spoken against the proposed HOA dues increase during that community meeting. Nobody else who supported the increase had been fined. Nobody who stayed silent had been fined. Just the 3 homeowners who publicly questioned the board. Daniel looked across his conference table, folded his hands together, and quietly said, "Congratulations. I think we just found motive." And by the time that morning arrived, I wasn't nearly as nervous as I expected. Maybe because this wasn't really about $650 anymore. It wasn't even about my trash cans. It was about whether the people running our neighborhood believed rules existed for everyone or only for the people they didn't like. The room itself looked surprisingly ordinary. Beige walls, folding tables, fluorescent lights that made everybody look slightly tired. Sharon Caldwell sat at one end with 2 other board members and the association's attorney. She glanced at me as I walked in, but quickly looked away. Daniel carried 2 banker's boxes filled with documents and quietly placed them beside our table. "Overprepared?" I whispered. He grinned. "There's no such thing." When the hearing began, Sharon spoke first. Her tone was polished, confident, almost rehearsed. She insisted the board possessed broad discretion when interpreting community standards and argued that maintaining neighborhood appearance required flexibility. "Our responsibility," she said, "is preserving property values through consistent enforcement." Daniel didn't interrupt. He simply waited until she finished before standing up with one thin binder in his hand. "Consistent enforcement," he repeated. I liked that phrase. He walked toward the hearing officer and handed over several enlarged color photographs. The first showed my trash bins at 7:44 Tuesday morning. The second showed another homeowner's bins at 7:45 Tuesday morning on the same date. Mine received a $650 fine. Theirs received nothing. Then came another pair, and another, and another. By the time he finished, nearly 30 photographs covered the evidence table, each one carefully labeled with dates, timestamps, addresses, and enforcement outcomes. The hearing officer spent several quiet minutes comparing photographs to the HOA handbook before looking directly at Sharon. "Can you explain," he asked calmly, "why these identical circumstances resulted in different enforcement actions?" For the first time that morning, Sharon didn't have an immediate answer. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something. But even from where I sat, I could tell the confidence she'd walked in with was beginning to disappear. The room suddenly felt much smaller, much quieter, and I realized we were only halfway through proving what had really happened. The silence lasted several long seconds before Sharon finally cleared her throat. "Every situation is evaluated individually," she said, forcing a smile that looked more uncomfortable than confident. Daniel nodded as though he agreed with her. "That's exactly what concerns us," he replied, "because the documents your own association produced don't show individual evaluation. They show selective enforcement." He clicked a remote, and a projector lit up behind him with the spreadsheet we'd spent days building. Columns of addresses, inspection dates, timestamps, board actions, and homeowner comments filled the screen. Even without understanding every number, anyone sitting in that room could see the pattern. Green rows stretched down the page representing homeowners who were photographed with trash cans visible on collection mornings and received no penalties. 3 rows were highlighted in red. Mine, Mark Henderson's, Grace Collins's. Daniel let the image hang there for a moment before speaking again. Would it surprise the board, he asked, to learn that these three homeowners also publicly opposed the proposed 20% dues increase at the March community meeting? Sharon didn't answer. One of the other board members shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while the association's attorney quietly rubbed his forehead as if he already knew where this was heading. The hearing officer leaned forward. "Is that statement accurate?" he asked. Another pause. Finally, the attorney answered instead. "Those individuals did participate in discussions regarding the budget proposal." Daniel smiled politely. "Thank you. That's all I needed." It wasn't some dramatic television courtroom moment where people gasped or slammed their fists on tables. It was quieter than that, and somehow even more satisfying. You could actually feel the atmosphere change. The confidence that had filled the HOA's side of the room when the hearing began had completely disappeared. Now they weren't defending a $650 fine. They were trying to explain why the same written rule somehow meant different things depending on who happened to be standing in front of them. The hearing officer spent another 15 minutes reviewing the evidence before closing the binder and looking directly at both parties. The governing documents clearly require trash containers to be stored within 24 hours following scheduled collection, he said. The association's interpretation that visibility alone constitutes a violation is not supported by the written rule presented today. He paused before continuing. Furthermore, the evidence demonstrates inconsistent application of enforcement standards among similarly situated homeowners. That sentence hit harder than any amount of money ever could. He ordered my violation removed immediately, canceled the fine in its entirety, directed the HOA to clear every related charge from my account, and formally warned the association that continued selective enforcement could expose it to civil liability and possible regulatory action against its nonprofit status. Nobody celebrated. Nobody clapped. Sharon simply gathered her papers without looking at me and walked out of the room faster than she'd walked in. Daniel packed his boxes, looked over at me, and quietly said, "Sometimes the truth does all the arguing for you." I don't think the board understood how quickly news travels in a neighborhood. By that evening, people were already knocking on my door, asking what had happened. Not because I went around telling everyone, but because communities like ours survive on conversations across driveways, over backyard fences, and while walking dogs after dinner. Within a week, several neighbors filed their own requests for association records. Others started attending board meetings for the first time in years. Questions that had never been asked suddenly became impossible to ignore. Why weren't financial reports more detailed? Why were violation policies so vague? Why did certain homeowners seem to receive warnings while others received fines? About a month later, Sharon resigned as board president without much explanation. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the HOA mailed every homeowner a new policy letter shortly afterward, emphasizing equal enforcement, transparency, and adherence to the exact language contained in the governing documents. Funny how quickly rules become important when someone proves you've been ignoring them. Linda walked over one Tuesday evening while I was rolling my trash bins back beside the garage, smiled, and said, "Looks like your garbage cans cleaned up more than just your driveway." I laughed because she wasn't wrong. The funny part is that none of this happened because I wanted revenge. I never set out to embarrass anyone or take down an HOA board. I simply refused to admit I was guilty of something I hadn't done. Sometimes that's enough to make people abusing a little authority very uncomfortable. Looking back now, the $650 was probably the cheapest lesson that board ever taught me. It reminded me that rules only matter when they're applied fairly, that asking respectful questions isn't being difficult, and that ordinary people have a lot more power than they realize when they're willing to document the facts instead of arguing with emotions. Every Tuesday morning, I still wheel my trash cans to the curb, and every Tuesday evening, I roll them right back where they've always belonged. The difference is that now I know something I didn't know before. Fairness doesn't protect itself. Someone has to insist on it. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have paid the fine just to make the problem disappear? Or would you have fought all the way to expose what the board was doing? And do you think the HOA president simply made an honest mistake? Or was this retaliation from the very beginning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this almost always spark strong opinions. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had to deal with an HOA that thought it was above its own rules. You never know whose next orange envelope might end up changing an entire neighborhood.